Good day. Welcome to Ata. Today we're talking to Agnes Kuptana from Ulukhaktuuq, and Agnes would like to share some of her stories with us. Agnes, welcome.
Yeah, I'd like to tell a story about how our ancestors were, and my parents and my grandparents. I guess as I was very little, getting packed, and I must have been about 1 year to 2 years old, and they were like long distance walkers inland. In the spring, they would go ashore from their winter hunting areas out on the sea ice, where they do all their sealing in the winter time when the ice is safe enough to go hunting for seals, so that they can also, when there's enough snow, to make their igloos. So in the spring comes, they would leave before the sun gets too warm and too high. They would leave their igloos, and because they know then the igloos won't last too long, because the warm weather is coming fast, and so they would leave the sea ice out on hunting the areas out on the sea ice, and they would come ashore to a place where they can, make casts and pile stones around where they can put their meat in, their hides, their oil that they had prepared for during the winter months. And they would, this book tells the story of it. It's called Bihayuyugut, and we are the long distance walkers, and that's what our ancestors were long ago. And it has some really pretty stories, and how in the spring they would come, upingakami. They would hit into spring. Each spring we would move off the sea ice, and this was around Ulukhaktuuq area, where my mother was born and raised. And this was in Prince Albert Sound. At Ulukhaktuuq, we built and marked casts to store our winter clothes and tools. And when the snow melted, we walked to Goog and followed the river to Tahiriok. Our ancestors left stone tent rings at Upingivik. The rings showed us where to camp. We spent spring here fishing, hunting birds, collecting eggs, and casting food. Like, that's what they have done. In the long winter months, they would come ashore, and this is what they do. And they would prepare a long distance walk up to Tahiriok area, where they would go along and look for caribou. And they would have pack dogs, and they didn't have very many. And maybe they might have 1 or 2 if they're lucky back then. And they pack, they have heavy weight on their back, and whatever they have, they go each day and try to make it to their destination, which is called Tahiriok. And that's where they would do their caribou hunting. And it's, 24-hour daylight, sunshine, and they don't have time, they don't have watches like we do today, and they, just only look at the sun and use it for their time. And that's how they lived. And I know, according to my grandmother's stories and my mother, and it was a hard life, but, and also it was a good life for them.
A good life.
Because they had everything. They didn't need to worry about, anything else, because they had it there. So they would walk up each day, however long distance they can take. They didn't rush. They go at their pace. And they would look around, and when they get hungry, they would stop, and they would eat with what little they have on their back. Or maybe along the river, the Goog River that they're talking about in the book, that they would maybe spear or look around, and even, it's a springtime, so the geese and birds are back. So they would be looking at, looking for eggs and picking up eggs, and they would pick wood here and there, whatever little dry wood there is, and they would make a fire with 3 stones together and make it's called kishuk, and they would look for ikutix, which is kind of a dry moss-like, and it burns really fast, even if it's a windy day, and they would boil their eggs if they find some eggs, whatever little they can, and if they're lucky, then they would get a bird or 2 and pluck them and cook them on an open fire there. And I'm sure what they have, they didn't have no pots and pans, so what they would have back then is carved stones that they carve to make a cooking pot. And they don't break, and that's what they carry on their back, and their ulus and their knives, and when they make this fire, women would be busy plucking, and they would be sitting around the fire that they have, and they would pluck and get their lunch ready and their meal ready, and maybe the men would be sitting on the side, looking at their bow and arrows, and just to make sure that, they're always looking around to see if, they see animal walking or a bird or anything, or even a rabbit. And while the food is cooking and the kids are, maybe helping here and there, because that's all we did back then. We learned from what we see and help our parents, our grandparents, and what we're told we, do, and that's what we did, because we listened to our grandparents, and that's how we learned. And the other book that I will be talking about later, it's called Nunamit Ulukhaktuuq, and that's like part of us that learn what we see and we do from our ancestors and from our parents and from our grandparents. And so they would, once they have a good meal, boiled eggs, geese or ducks, whatever they cook, then they would, they're nice and full, and they would rest for a bit, they're always telling stories. There's never no ending to stories whenever they sit down, what they did for the day, how did their day go, and and they're always looking to see, the weather patterns, how the weather will take for them as they go along. And once they done again, then they would get up and put things away and get ready again and move on till they make it to where they want to, try and look for caribou. And when they make it to Tahiriyok, they would maybe just have caribou skin tents, or even seal, and they call them tupik, and they just put up with like a little teepee with their fish spears or hooks, long hooks, and whatever they can find, or even their unak, and they're put together in 3, and they would put out this dried skin, or even seal skins that are sewn together to make a tupik. Same thing with the caribou hides, the some caribou hides. And they would put stones around, and according to my grandmother's stories, what she does in my days when I was growing up out on the land, following the seasons and the animals, she always cooking outside in the open fire. It's called kishuk, the way I was telling you earlier in the beginning of the story, and she's always cooking. And there's river, and the kids or someone would go and get water, and what they have is bags that are sewn together from hides inside out, sewn from inside and sewn from outside with a little handle so that they can use these to go and get water. And they would walk around, women would walk around and look for thin stones that are really thin along the side of the rivers so that they can gather them together, make like a mat so that they can eat on it or even cut up their fish or their birds or their geese, whatever they catch. And that's how they lived. And when they go up to Dahirioq, a place called Dahirioq, and that's where they would camp. And it's a really big lake, and I've never been to it, but from the stories that I hear from my grandmother, my grandparents, and my mother's side, and my parents, that's where, a lot of the people lived back then, and following the animals and the caribou. And when the caribou is migrating from south to north, and then that's when they hunt them. And whatever they can get, they prepare their hides, dry their hides, and they would make dry meat, and once everything is all dried and before fall, they would pack all their belongings again, and then they would start to head back down towards the coast. And once they get down to Gook River, and they would be preparing, and they would put up their tents again and make camps, and women would be busy preparing their hides because this is the clothing that they would be needing for the whole winter months, that they're out on the sea ice hunting, and for their families. And I'm sure in the spring, when they're first going back up, because they're long-distance walkers, so what they have on their boots, just like the muklaks that I was using yesterday, which I should have did today so that I can show you, that they would be using the Ulukhaktuuq bottom crimped hide, so that, and they would also have on the sole bottom, where the Ulukhaktuuq bottom is crimped with your teeth and sewn, and they would also patch them so that, because they're walking up on land, and as they go, then they have, depending how far they go inland to look for animal and for caribou, they're walking on land and some gravel and whatnot. So what happens is their gummicks would start to become some holes here and there. So what they would do is, each night as they pitch up, the women are busy because they would remember to bring extra, so that they're patching all the time and preparing their clothing and whatever, and drying. And they didn't have ropes or anything. They would have these sealskin hides that they prepare for rope and dry them in the sun in the springtime. So what they do is when they catch a seal, they just cut it in the flipper and on the head part, and then they would use a man would use a long knife and then just cut it. And then once it's all out, a woman would take over with the ulu, put it inside out and flush it. And then a woman would be holding the hide. Once it's done, flushed, a man would take the smaller knife and just prepare from one end, just going round and round till they make sure all this, they have enough rope, and it's all cleaned, and they would stretch it long distance outside, and the sun would dry that. And once it's dried, a man would to make sure that he would go out each day till he takes all the hair off and clean the skin inside to make sure that it's ready for the ropes that they need, either to use for the harpoon, for spearing fish, or for the harpoons that they use in the wintertime in the igloos, in the seal holes when they're looking for seal hunting for in the winter time so that they can have oil and food and clothing that they use in the cold winter months in the igloo. But back then, our people, they did not know what was cold because they were so just warm.
They were always dressed warm.
Always warm, yeah, like with the caribou hides and caribou clothing, the muklaks and the mitts. And this is what they prepare in the fall time when they go back down. But before they go back down in the river, in the mouth of the river, in the big lakes, they would stop and they would, also do some fishing, and that's when the fish are going back up in the fall time to the lakes to spawn, especially the Arctic char. And then they would make stone casts, like make a weir with stone, just piling them up so that. When the fish are going up and the river is going, then they're full, but they only have little certain openings so that the river water is still going and the fish is going up, but then they're in this stone weir that's made out of rocks piled up, so that they do all their spearing, and that's where they make all their the men and women would be helping spearing and catching fish, and they would have all these skin, the rope that I was telling you about, and they would have a loop of made out from either a back leg of a caribou, like the buttock part. They make so that they can just put it through the head, fish head, and they would have a long line, and once everything is done, it's still daylight before fall, and they would make all their dry meat and dry them, and then they have a lot to pack down when they're walking back down to the shoreline, and to prepare all their hides and their clothing. And once they reached back down to Cook River, then they would be busy. Even the men would be busy scraping hides so the women can start making clothing. And once all the hides are done, and also the men would be busy with their preparing their harpoons and whatnot, so that when the sea ice is thick enough and safe, then they can go out to the sea ice in the fall time and for the winter months, that where they hunt, make igloos and hunt their seals. And in between, before they go out, they would celebrate. They're always celebrating. And they would be drum dancing, they would be feasting, they would be storytelling. And the little children are always, sitting down and listening. And it's, everybody is always in the language. It's all in the language back then. And from a little child on, everybody, speak the language. They speak the Inuit, and maybe we have some people who speak little Inuvialuktun, because back then we had people the Inuvialuktun people that came from mainland, like they come by ship, by schooners, and they're traveling, and they're camping, and they're trading, and that's how they helped each other back then. So they picked up the language. So you would hear different language, because when I was growing up, I see people do come from Western Arctic, even in the summer or fall, and in the winter, especially in the spring, for like before Easter comes there, or even for Christmas, they get together, and we see, we know because they Inuvialuit from the west, because they would have a debauking, and their dogs are just one dark line,
one ahead of each other,
and
Well, that's
and
how I
somebody
grew up. Was like that.
yeah,
Had one dog.
yeah,
Everything.
and that's how I see there. It's different people coming. They call them Tuyongmiat, Tuyongmiat Tikilakpud, meaning that we have visitors from the west, called Olinangmiut, and we know because we could also hear these the little bells on some harnesses that they have, and it's exciting and for the people would go out and they would greet them, and somebody already would have hot water on a kurlek, and there's always food ready and cooked, and they would go meet them, and as little kids were scared because we don't know them, but we would follow behind our mom and dad. Sometimes our dad would be holding our hands and telling us, "Taki, taki, taki, kaiguin, inuitikilakpun, come on, follow us." He said, "Let's go and greet these people. They're our visitors, and they're Inuvialuit." So we would follow them, and we see that they communicate, they know each other because, this is not their first time coming in. And they would welcome them and help them tie down their dogs and welcome them to their igloos and bring them in. And neriguiti, they would be calling. Neriguiti, they would go out and they're always hollering, calling for somebody else to come and eat, or tea, it's time for tea break, or eat time, and they would say neriguiti. And when you hear that, people do gather and they bring a little bit of something, and maybe somebody might carry a bannock, like, in those days. By then, you have Hudson Bay and Father, the Roman Catholic mission, and those were about the only people that were in Ulukhaktuuq back then, along with maybe 2-3 families, Jacob and Agnes Neriyuk and Jacob Nipalariuk, and who was related to the Ulukhaktuuq, and of course there was Wallace and Agnes Goose and the Memoranas. Those were the only few families. Everybody else was out on the land. So they knew the language. So what they do is, they would be telling stories, and the children would gather, and they're sitting down, and whenever you hear somebody telling stories, you just sit down and you're listening, and you can remember, people exchanging. They're laughing. They're always laughing, and they're eating. There's food on down there, and tea is on, bannock is on, and somebody else would bring maybe dry meat or dry fish, or maybe a part of cooked, boiled, fresh meat, such as caribou or seal or young seal, and they're eating and they're feasting, and after that they relax a bit and tell more stories, and the drum dancing begins, and that's where they celebrate before they head out to the sea ice. And just get back to when I first seen the Inuvialuit from the west. We were in Ulukhaktuuq, because Holman back then, it was called Holman Island. I don't know why it was called Holman Island, because Holman, the island is about 7 miles away from the town, but it was called Holman Island. And I remember, people getting excited, and this was around just before Christmas back then. The weather, it was like minus 50, 60 below. It was very cold, but again, like I say, growing up, we didn't know what cold was, because we grew up out on the land, raised out on the land, following our parents. They follow the seasons, the animals, and we're dressed warm, and we're always busy. If our chores are done and the story time begins in the evening. but I remember exactly the day, somebody started hollering, out loud, Tuyong Metikilakpot, meaning that, it's the visitors are coming from Walingang, from the west, and you could hear these. And in the evening, before it get dark, if it's a cold day, you could hear a dog team from long ways going cha cha chi chi, and you could hear the sleds or the bargains, the snow. You could hear it, and they're coming, and there's more coming in, and people are excited. They start to gather. They start to walk where the igloos are, and then they start to walk together, gathered together. And when the dog team stopped, they would anchor and they would say hello, and they're excited because it's not the first time they see them. And I remember them so well that they would go in to eat, and they would help them put a tent up. They would have double tents, and that was the first time that I ever start seeing double tents. Yeah. And they would help them, and they would give them, somebody else would bring a seal meat, and they chop it for them, and they would feed their dogs. And again, they gather, and they get them back, and Inabel would be telling stories of their long-distance travel coming in for Christmas. And people do gather for Christmas back then, whether by then, it was already in Holman Island, and because before there was Hudson Bay there and the Roman Catholic mission, then the place where they used to gather back then was at Walker Bay. And of course, and I guess there was a small Hudson Bay post there too, so it was like a stop area for both Inuvialuit and Kangmalit. Trapping areas, and that's where they would go for supplies. So people, after they shut down there, and they opened one up in Ulukhaktuuq back then that's where the people would be gathering for Christmas and for Easter. And that's when I remember so clearly that, and I think it was Angnangnek and Asakpan, and I wouldn't remember the others, but they knew them. And they would come, and they would spend Christmas there, and people would gather, and people would have service. They would gather at one of the Hudson Bay small unit that there was no heat in it, but it was just the empty building. So they would call it Ulukhaktuuq, place where you call like a Gatimavik, place where you gather. And it gets full. And you don't see kids running around. Everybody is, been out on the hunting areas, and you see strangers. You're sitting by your parents, or sitting on their laps, or sitting beside them, and you're nice and quiet. And the only two children that I ever see in the gatherings running about, it's like, showing off and whatnot, how kids do when there's big gatherings, was Simon Gadayak and Billy Goose. Everybody else would be with their parents and sitting down and just looking at people, and people shaking hands, still saying Merry Christmas after a service, and they eat. Everybody would bring food. All kinds of food, fancy. It's all country food.
Yes.
And very little was cooked, but they would, have a big feast, and Hudson Bay manager would come down and, would bring in a big pot of tea and iced tea water, and I don't know anything about coffee back then. I never know if there was anything, but. And this is what they have, and they would feast, and after everything is all cleaned and whatnot, then I remember it's followed by a square dance, for an old-time dance, and I remember Alec Banksland playing the accordion, and Nepalari would be playing the fiddle, and I remember Timothy Lenny would be calling out, or Morris Nayo.
Yeah.
And they would be square dancing and whatnot. And I remember the Hudson Bay manager giving out, open a box of you didn't see no boxes back then. It was like little wooden boxes,
Yeah.
little crates. Like he would put in chocolates and candy and whatnot, and give out, open it and walk around and try and give out some to the children. But to us, we didn't grow up with it, so we didn't know what was chocolate or candy, because we were raised out on the land, and our treats were like dry meat and whatnot, and sure, grandparents or mom and dad or dad, when he goes in for supplies to Holman Island back then, would maybe buy a box of snack bar and a box of juicy fruit.
Yeah.
And it lasts for a long, long time, because like I said, we didn't grow up with sweets, so we didn't know what was chocolate and candy. So when the Hudson Bay manager is going around the room trying to give out, but the mom and dads are picking, but us, children, it didn't bother us, because we didn't grow up with it. We didn't know what it was. They would, have a drum dance, and then square dance, and then maybe 4 more drum dancing and square dancing. And by then, you can't stay up no more, you're sleeping. And I remember as my cheek starts to get cold and I wake up, and my dad is packing me up here, carrying me on his shoulders and going home back to the igloos.
Yeah.
And it's like the morning comes really early, and you could hear dogs, because people are getting ready for a big race. And you could see these visitors. They have fancy toboggans, they have fancy harnesses, fancy. I used to love watching them with my father, as my father gets ready to go for dog races, and because it's something new to us. And I used to wonder how these dogs were harnessed. They were ropes along, and the harness is right in there. Yeah. But for us, it's side by side, and they're loose traces. Yeah. And I used to watch them and be just amazed and how fancy they're. They come long ways visiting Ulukhaktuuq, Holman Island back then, for Christmas and for Easter, and they have long traces, like we do, like side by side, but for them, they're long, and they would have like 11, 13 dogs, and they're fancy, and, they're beautiful harnesses, and you have little bells in them, and there used to be lots of people coming, and with dog queues from all over, like, it might be a 7-dog race for the men, and 5 dogs race for the women. And the men would go long distance, and the women would just go around the island. And the Hudson Bay manager would put up prices such as flour, sugar, and again they were in sacks. There was no paper back then, and maybe a woman's beautiful print or two, maybe a bunch of cornmeal to make dog pots for the dogs. And I remember there was a little bit of goodies here and there, and canned fruits and butter, and everything else was in cans. And it was I remember the butter cans were round, and I think they were in either a red or orange colored, and they were really good butter back then. And the men would go for long distance race, and while they wait for the men to return to see who's going to come first, second, third, then they would be playing prisoner base, or they would have foot races, or they call it hakbig, means like soccer ball type, and that's what they played. And the dog team starts to arrive, and they gather again and to see who's going to come first, second, third, and they didn't just have the men and women dog races. And the next day, maybe they would go, call it Ulukhaktuuq, where they have put sticks up, and you have to go a certain way to lead your dog. You had to have a good leader back
good leaders,
then.
huh? Yeah.
Good leaders, and people did have good leaders and good teams. I remember my father was given, because he gave them the outlad, the invalid that came, he would give them seal meats, because before things, they would go early in the morning, it starts to get bright, and they would go check seal hooks, and he would come back with seal and then freeze them, and telling them that there is plenty of seal there, there's food for your dogs if you want to make a dog pot. So I remember before they left, one of them gave my dad a really nice a female dog and another male dog. So that's where he raised a new team. And people visited back then. They visit each other. They tell stories. And when things are done, the next night would be over at the RC mission, at the Roman Catholic mission. They would be playing games, and they would be giving out star candies and whatnot. And again, we didn't know what was candy, so our parents would be just taking a few, because they knowing that the children are not going to eat it anyway. And they, having tea, and they're eating, and they're telling stories, and lots of laughter, and they're playing games, and we just watch. And people would go as their ways when everything is done, and back to their hunting areas, and back to their camps. And these Tuyongmen, they call them Walinangmiut, the Western people would leave, and they're given, seals so that they can make dog pots, and as they go back to their destination, and however it takes them, and saying that maybe spring comes, they'll come back, or when they gather, before they go, I remember people would gather before they anchor off to take off, and somebody would be saying a prayer with them, and an elder would come around, and then they would pray for them, and they'd be praying outside before they leave. They gather, and their goodbyes, and they go. And those are the memories of what I grew up with. And like I was saying, our Inuit were the long distance walkers, and so in the wintertime, when they get in from upland and they go down to the coast, and when the sea ice is safe enough and thick enough to travel on, and enough snow to make their igloos, then they would go out into the sea ice, and they would build igloos, and they helped each other, and before you know it, all the teams, all the outlaws, the families have igloos here and there, not together, but in some distance, where they would find a certain snow to make a good igloos that would last a winter before spring. And that's how they did their seal hunting, and out in the seal holes, and they walk, and they may have just a few dogs that they have, and they train certain dogs to find seal holes. And I remember my grandfather had one big male dog that he had trained to look for seal holes out on the sea ice, and I used to go with him. And when he gets a seal, he makes sure that he had a sealskin pack sack that he uses. He would empty it out into something else, like to a sealskin, a seal that has holes and that you loop around, and where he puts his seal hooks or his knives and that, or his extra rope, and he would be pulling that. And what he does, and he waits till the seal that he gets out of the seal hole is quite frozen enough so that it can be pulled from one dog. And he used to tie that pack sack on the stomach part where I can sit and hold on to the seal arms that, I'll hold on to them so I don't fall off, and the dog would take me home to the igloos. And he would be waiting, checking other seal hooks, and if he gets a seal, he pulls it out and pulls it home by himself while the dog takes me home. And one of my cousins would be going in and out to see if any of us would be coming back. And once I reached, and he would come out and tie the dog and bring in the seal, and the woman would cut it up, and they would share the fat and the meat, and they would maybe freeze some ribs and of course the liver and the good parts to freeze outside with a little bit of fat on it, so that when it's time to eat next day, they would eat it as clock, or they would boil the ingalloks, the insides, and then freeze them too, so that they can have them for fresh meal the next day. And people shared back then, and they helped each other, and what they get from the seals, they never waste. Everything is used. And they would prepare the hides and clean them, flush them, and put them out on the side of a igloo so the sun can dry them. Or if they have enough skins, then some they would boil enough ice or melt enough snow and boil it hot enough so they can put the skin in, which is already fleshed, and dip it on and off into the pot so that the hair starts to come off. They would take all the hair off, and they would put these seal skins to dry outside from the sun, so they become white in the winter, in the spring months, and they're dried outside, and all the hides were dried outside, and from the sun, when the sun comes back. And I remember my grandmother and the people back then, when the sun first come back in the spring, they celebrate. They celebrate. They would have a seal skin or a caribou hide that's dried, and they would put in They would cut up dry meat. They would cut up fish quack. All the bestest food that they have, they would cut chunks of it into it, and they would go outside and they walk towards the sun, and they're singing and they're drum dancing, and then the two elders would pick up this hide, and then they would throw it towards the sun to say thank you for the returning of the sun. Because, it's the sun, once again, is back. It's going to give heat. It's going to give light. And the daylight's getting longer, and they're excited because, the cold, long winter months are almost over, and it's almost time for them to go towards shorelines again, so that they can prepare, put away their meat and whatnot, and meat cast, so that they can get ready all over again to go long distance walk into the land and look for pig eggs, and and also do some fishing in the spring into the lakes, like jiggling, Ulukhaktuuq, and while they're Ulukhaktuuq too, they would have these fish spears by their fish holes in a certain way, so that they can spear. If the fish are not biting in certain time, then they would be spearing if the fish are not biting right in the holes, and that's how they get their fish too. Because some days depending on the weather, then the fish are there, but they're not biting. So they would be spearing them too. And those were the memories of the long-distance walkers that I remember growing up. And I was born and raised out on the land and taught by listening to the stories and watching my grandparents or watching my mom and dad and how they taught us to sew and to prepare hides. And it's always, everything was always in the language. And that's how we learned. And what we learned is what we want to pass on to our youth and to our grandchildren of today, so that when we are not there for them in the future, then they know that what they have learned from the elders and from their parents and their grandparents, then they can live it, try and live it, and maybe not the full what they are taught and told, but at least, they can still know their culture and their tradition out on the land. And that's how I was raised and where I was born out on the land and raised and learned from my ancestors and from my grandparents and my parents and the boys too. They were taught from a very young age, and they were taught how to make tools and how to survive out on the land. They're taught how the wind patterns are and how it is, if it's safe to travel, if it's out on the sea ice, or if it's enough snow to travel and to watch for thin ice, and if the lakes are safe enough to cross, or if you still have to go around them in order to get to where you want to go fishing, fish netting, and that's how we were taught and raised, and this is what we were going to try and teach our children, our grandchildren, and our youth of today, so that they can, remember the language, and a lot of it is to do with the language by speaking it, and to try and encourage them to speak it, and even if it's just one day, like, in a business places, answer your telephone in a language.
Yes.
If you see an elder, speak to them in the language. And if we have elders and youth gathering, then we have games for maybe even a homework for an elder and a youth, like one-on-one. You find a partner and you tell the youth the language, if you're on like working one-on-one, then you have a choice of whether if it's hunting stories or or what is the word for so and so, and so you tell the youth the language, and the youth will tell the elder the opposite of what you can remember. Like if you're going to travel, like, for medical or something, and you don't reach that age yet where you need an escort, then how can you remember if you need help and suddenly you forget? How can you remember to ask for help? And, the English part, the English word for it, how can you remember it? So 1 week comes and they get back together and they each, after they go in a circle, then they would remember, and there'll be a time where an elder is trying to pronounce the English word to try and remember, so that how they can help themselves when they're alone. And they have to travel out for medical, and the youth, and they would tell us how they used that word. How did you learn that enveloped word that you learned? How did you use it in the community or out on the land, or if you're just out visiting an elder, how did you use it? Did you use it to go get an ice for them? Or did you use it to go cook for them, cut meat, or feed them? How did you use that word? And they have to tell the story of it. So it's, encouraging them, not pushing them, but telling them how, you can help them out, how they can help each other. Yeah. And how much time do I have so that I can tell a little bit about
how much time do we have left? 10 more?
10 more minutes?
Sure.
The next story that I would like to go into is called Nunamin Iliharbeah. It's learning from the land. In our community of Ulukhaktuuq, we have different programs. One of them is called Nunamin Iliharbeah, learning from the land. When they come to us, to myself and to my husband Robert, we talk about it and we, try and still, even though we're not involved with the community corporations or board or anything like that anymore, we still try and help our people, our elders and our youth especially, and single parents, how we can try and help them for their future. One of them was the programs that we come up with a program, then maybe have somebody from the community corporation or from the elders committee to try and look for funds and to access funds so that when the funds come, then these programs can take place. One of them was called Nunamin Iliharbeah, was learning from the land. And it's not just only going out on the land and learning, but it also involves sewing, elders showing the youth and the children age, depending on age groups, how to do hides, prepare hides. The boys and the youth and the elders, guys would go out and maybe they do some seal hooking and they would get seals, bring it in. The girls, with the help of an woman elder, they would prepare the hides, cut them up and cook meals and share the meals and how they can prepare meals and the hides together, so that once the hide is dried and they can prepare it maybe in the sewing group, like soften it, scrape it, soften it, and use it for maklaks, for gamiks, and maybe somebody else would prepare when somebody gets a ukik and they would donate it, and then they would have the youth help with the elders prepare it and dry it, and if it's a young ukik especially, because they're good for easier to crimp for our young people, so that they work together and do these hides. So they would have sewing groups. And another one under this program we look at is how the young men, our youth and the elders would make tools and use these tools to go out on the sea ice or go seal hunting and make nikhik, the seal hooks that you make from a plain metal, pound it, and then you bend it, and how you make it into one hook, and then you would have three of them together, and how they prepare them and use them to go look for seal holes. And there was still enough dog teams yet now. Not now, but back then, then somebody would take children out with a dog team, and they would have maybe one trained dog that they use to find seal holes. And just by sniffing, they would encourage the dogs, and then the youth would take this dog, certain trained dog, and to go look for seal holes. And when they do, then the youth would, the elder would help a youth to put in a seal hook, and a few days later then they would have enough students from the school that are interested to go out and have permission from their parents with a paper signed, and they would take them out by the team and go look at these books and to see if there's any luck. Or another one would be muskak hunts, and where they would have sleds or skidoos to take the children out, and towards the spring, it's like one thing where the elders and where youth go together and out on the land and just learn about the stories, the language, and drum dancing, and how the life was long ago. And they listened and they learned, and they, it's like their homework where they write down, and when they go back to the school, then this is what they report, what they learned out on the land. So it's all different programs that I just picked up this book to see and to share what we do, because it have all different youth, not only youth but the young adults too, how to make tools down here, so you can see out on the sea ice. This is the unaks and the spears that they have. This is what they do. And also another one would be sled making. So this is all different things that they do from this book. And another one is, where they take the children out and the survival skills and the weather patterns. Yeah.
Out on the land.
So that, they know how, and we still have a few elders that do go out and they, meet together, and they would, so that when the youth go out, they know what to expect.
Yes.
Like what the weather going to turn out into today, what the weather, what it's like, how you can tell if it's going to be a good weather or a bad weather, if a storm is coming up.
Are they they're also teaching the youth how to make the igloo?
Igloos.
They make the igloos, huh?
Yes. Robert does that. Like he gets together with the youth and they would build igloos. Yeah. And once igloos are kulak making, and kulaks are done, and they would put in, and they would make one small one and one nice big one, so that they can bring in a kulak and have them dancing in there and eat in there, just like the old way. And this is to show and tell the story same time, and eating and telling stories in there, and drum dancing, and they take turns. The group will go, and maybe the next day a different group will come, and different elders, so that everybody gets a chance to give their story. So we try and carry on these programs. Yeah. And all through this we try and use the language, but if sometimes the language is too strong, or if it's old wording or the old language that they're using, then you got to explain and again in English to the young people, so that they can understand that they are using the old words, because there is old words and different new words that we hear from visitors we get from the Kidamir area, and how we share especially the Inuit, because Cambridge Bay, Joe Haven, and Ulukhaktuuq and Ulukhaktuuq, it's Inuit and some Inuit.
So there's little difference. There's always that little difference in the language.
Same meaning but different wording.
A little different. Yeah. That's Ata for today, and we'd like to say Koe Naini to Agnes Kuptana for sharing her stories. Koe Naini, Agnes.
Sorry, I just got hit.
Okay. Koe Naini.